Data management plans, say how to. So I'm Kati from Aalto University, where I work in research services, a data advisor, and I work with data management plans. I help our researchers with data management plans to write them, and we review them in research services. And we also help our researchers with other questions related to research data management. And so we came up with this idea of talking about DMPs and what kind of questions we often run into and how we see them. What are the pitfalls and what are the qualities of good DMP maybe? So I'm here with my colleague Antti. Antti, would you like to say a few words about yourself as well?
Hello, nice to be with you all today, and I look forward to a lively discussion. Okay, but please take it away, Kati.
Okay, thank you so much, Antti. So this is the outline of the talk, and we do not follow any specific data management plan template, but we have tried to take bits and pieces from different templates, and we are trying to focus on the topics where we find that we get most questions about, like ethical and legal compliance and data sharing. And we will not be focusing that much on data documentation and data storing today, because we think that people know how to respond to those sections in a DMP quite well. And we have separate webinars coming up on the data storing and also data sharing as well. And we have in the presentation that we share, there are links to those webinars. If you want to join them, it's still possible to register. And we will conclude by giving some resources to DMP writing that may be useful, for instance, DMP templates of different funders, and also DMP exemplars. And for those who work at Aalto, there are some web pages that may be useful, and there are other things as well at the end of the talk. So the objectives of today, this webinar, are that everyone, irrespective of their background, understands the objectives of data management plans and how they relate to different stages of a research project. And also we hope to give you some practical tips for writing data management plans. And we hope to provide you with knowledge about some resources that may be useful for you if writing a data management plan is a part of your work. And then, because I wanted to start with very basics, I don't make any assumptions about your background, and I think that we may come from different fields of research and from different backgrounds. I wanted to start with the very basics. So what is a data management plan? Well, this is a definition from the US Geological Survey, who say that a DMP, or data management plan, describes data that will be acquired or produced during research, how the data will be managed, described, stored, what standards you will use, and how data will be handled and protected during and after the completion of a project. So basically, a DMP is a plan on how you will process your data safely. It's about research data in a research project. That is the essence of a DMP. And many of you may have written, or you may be planning to write a DMP for one funder or another. But you don't have to write it for any specific funder. You can write a DMP anytime, basically, for any research project, because ideally it can help you manage your data and avoid problems with data management. For instance, if you have personal data, you have to be well-versed with some aspects of the things like the General Data Protection Regulation by the EU and things like that. But as I already mentioned, it also, that way you can comply with funder requirements, because I would say that most funders today, they require that you write a DMP for them at some point when you apply for funding. Yeah, but you can write a DMP whenever a research project begins, and at best it's a living document that you may update throughout the research project and even beyond. As I was already referring to, many funding agencies nowadays require data management plans, and I have examples here from the Academy of Finland and Business Finland. They are Finnish funders who require data management plan today. or from those who apply for funding. And there's also an example from Horizon Europe, the new framework program by the EU that started in the beginning of this year. And they are also saying that data management plans are mandatory. So some of you may remember that in the previous Horizon 2020 program, there was an ORD pilot project that was you could opt out if you wanted to. But in the current ongoing Horizon Europe framework program, DMPs are actually mandatory. So they are very important to those who basically conduct research nowadays. So when do you write a DMP? Basically, in the beginning of the project, or even before the beginning of the project, when you apply for funding, like I was saying, many funders ask for you to write maybe a short description of how you will manage your data when you apply. Some funders ask for you to send a longer description if you receive funding, and some say that you will have to write it 5 months, 6 once the research project has started. My personal opinion is that if you write it after the project has already started, that's not the optimal case, because there are things that you have to take into account before you start, for instance, data collection. If you have personal data, there are many things that you need to have considered before starting. Like, for instance, the ethical reviews. If you need ethical reviews, you cannot get them after you have started the data collection. So that's why it's good to write a data management plan as soon as possible, even before the beginning of the project. And ideally, you would be updating it once the project has started. When you collect data, you store your data somewhere, you analyze it, and when you share your data, that's the time for updating your DMP. And many funders, the direction is into that you will be updating your data management plan throughout the lifetime of the project. So that is becoming if not a requirement for all funders, it's at least a recommendation that you will be doing that. And then there's the long-term preservation aspect for data. So that's something that you also have to consider when you at least write a DMP. And if there's something that needs to be updated later, even after the end of the project, you may need to update your DMP even once the project has already ended. So there are many aspects to DMPs. Unfortunately, we have limited time today, so we cannot go to all of them, but we wanted to focus on the most, let's say, problematic things, maybe, or more complicated things of the DMP, like data sharing. But at this point, I would like to hear from you what you think about what is the most interesting aspect, or what you would like to learn about in a DMP. So I'm going to start a poll, so you can have your say. So we have quite a few answers coming. I think what we have most responses for are legal and ethical questions. So Antti, we chose the right topic because we wanted to focus on that. That's what interests our audience as well. And the second is data sharing and archiving. So that's also what we wanted to focus on. So we chose the right topics. But it's also interesting that data storing and metadata standards are of interest. So we have pretty even situation here when it comes to topics of interest. But we are going to share everything, all the materials with you later on, so don't worry. And Antti, would you like to take over now?
Yes, sure. I think we can proceed with the legal and ethical compliance regarding the DMPs. And I think some of the key concepts that are good to understand. Maybe you are quite familiar with this, but let's just go through them quite quickly. So within the context of Europe, I think the terms personal data and sensitive data are important. And even if you wouldn't collect them directly, I think it's beneficial to understand the concept so you understand your university's IT classification and privacy policy. I think it's useful in that sense. So personal data is all data related to an identified or identifiable person. And I think it's sometimes useful to kind of look at it through direct identifiers, or how you can identify the person. It's either to direct identifiers or then to deducing the identity to use of indirect identifiers. So first you want to kind of really do an informed decision whether you are collecting personal data or not, because that will affect many things in the DMP then. So the direct identifiers are things like a human voice, that's unique, social security number, name is considered a direct identifier. So if you are collecting this type of data, then you are collecting personal data, and that's often something that, at least in my experience, is kind of often confused with, that if you audio tape your interviews, then you are collecting personal data. And then we have indirect identifiers, which are the kind of a combination of different pieces of information. So and how you could kind of combine those to identify individuals, and here also kind of the size of the population matters. So let's say that I would collect data, like I would have all Finnish persons that can play the piano. Now that's really difficult to identify individuals from that type of data. But if we would have, for example, a single class or a course where there's five people enrolled, like I would know that they're all Finnish citizens. I would know that, let's say that they each have different instruments that they play, and one of them plays the piano. So then the combination of these three, in a sense, indirect identifiers, it gets you almost like 100% the possibility of identifying a single person. So it's good to think of through your personal data, both through direct identifiers and then indirect ones. And then we have the special categories of personal data, or I think it's a quite common parlance to call these categories of personal data as sensitive data. So these are from the GDPR. And they are personal data revealing racial, ethnic origin, political opinions, and religious or philosophical beliefs, and trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data processed solely to identify a human being, and then health-related data, and then data concerning a person's sex life or sexual orientation. So what is also quite common, at least in my experience, that researchers often mistake sensitive data for personal data. So they are saying that, well, I'm not really collecting personal data when they're referring to sensitive data. But please do remember that all data from which you can identify people either through direct or indirect identifiers is personal data, and then you are operating under the GDPR. Now, another key thing of understanding these two concepts is, I think, then your university's privacy policy and the data classification that your university uses. And it becomes much more understandable when you know the concepts of, for example, personal and sensitive data. So, for example, in our university, the IT classification goes into public, internal, and confidential and secret data. So, for example, this confidential classification here, it does include personal data, trade secrets, and research proposals, for example. So this seems a bit complex that you would have these two types of classification, but it's not really that difficult. Once you kind of understand personal data and the special categories of it, then you can kind of see that how it goes into the IT classification or the privacy policy of your university, and then you can see where you can store these different types of data. So I would say these two data categories or these categorizations of data are really important from the viewpoint of the DMP. So you should understand these both, and they'll give you the backbone, I would say, of your DMP. And if you don't collect personal data, then you don't. And then you can kind of look into maybe how public data in your university is then disseminated. But I would argue these two things are of great importance. Like, understand what is personal data, whether you collect it or not, and then see how your university IT handles different types of data. So I would say those are, at least in my experience, they are kind of the backbone or key elements of a DMP. Kati, could I have the next slide, please? And sometimes, thank you. So sometimes people say that the data management plan isn't like it's a plan, like it has no practical relevance. Well, I would challenge that. I would challenge that. And here's a case why it's actually of great practical importance. So, for example, if you can ascertain that you do collect personal data, and then maybe we start from here. If you first you ascertain yes, and then you have to do certain things. You have to ascertain the legal basis for processing of personal data. You have to plan the entire life cycle of personal data, and then you have to obtain the data subject consent to participate in research and inform the data subject with a private notice is what we would do. So, and these happen, as Kati mentions, already in the very early stages of research. So you need to know the life cycle of your personal data before you start to proceed with the collection of it. And that's where the DMP is most useful and very actually a practical tool in this sense. And this is very difficult, for example, at least in my experience, for doctoral students that do their first research and start doing interviews or surveys, that to kind of get them to acknowledge that, in fact, before they start the data collection, they should have the entire life cycle of the personal data kind of planned out, because the privacy notice will then inform the data subjects about the plan. And one thing, yes, so in this sense, the data management plan is it's very important because it drafts out how you will kind of handle the life cycle of your personal data. And you could kind of argue again that, well, maybe it's not just personal data. Maybe you want to share your thoughts or your case on this, that maybe also if you do computational research and don't collect data from human subject, maybe it's a wise thing to know in advance what the lifestyle data of let's say the planned life cycle of the data will be before you obtain the data itself, because then you can kind of think of these different, as Kati will talk about data sharing, like already in the phase where collecting. So in that sense, data management plans are really actually practical and important parts, and as Kati mentioned, they should be done early on in the process. So one thing that I like to mention about personal data, because that also kind of, at least in my experience, causes confusion. So you have to kind of ascertain the legal basis of processing of personal data. And we'll have a seminar on handling of personal data the 12th of October. So they will go into a bit more detail into these things there, which I highly recommend. But there's some things that we can still kind of maybe discuss here, because it makes the rest of my presentation more understandable. Is that usually when you ascertain the legal basis of processing your personal data, at least here in Aalto University, there's often two options. There's the performance of a task carried out in the public interest, or consent of the data subject. That is the legal basis of processing personal data. But that is in essence different than, for example, the research ethical norm of informed consent that you need to obtain. So what I find that researchers kind of sometimes get confused, that if they choose the performance of a task carried out in public interest as the legal basis of processing of personal data, then they often feel like, okay, consent is not my legal basis, so I don't need informed consent or inform the participants. And this is not true. They are in a sense very different things. So informed consent, or here the consent to participate in research, I'm getting questions, but I think I'll go through this through first, and we'll go in the questions then in the later on. So so you need consent to participate in research. That is the research ethical norm, the informed consent, and then you need the data privacy notice, which informs the research what you will do with their data. So that is sometimes it's referenced also as the data consent. I see that formulation as well. So you need two consents, regardless of what your legal basis for processing personal data is. And then you have to use the IT department systems that are then you have to know, again, the classification that I was referring to, that you know how to store the data properly. But yes, these are some of the terms that we'll go through quickly. And there's the training coming on the 12th of October, which I really recommend. We don't have that much time here to go through this, but this will make the rest of the presentation maybe more understandable. And then, Kati, if I can have the next slide. So within ethical and legal compliance, so what you have to discuss in the DMP if you have personal data. So it's good to kind of know that, okay, how, if it's not obvious, then how the identifiers will be identified. Of course, you mentioned Data Protection Act and General Data Protection Act, the GDPR. And privacy by default is a strong principle in GDPR, and also data minimization. Data minimization means that you don't collect unnecessary personal data. You don't collect personal data just for the sake of collecting it, and maybe I'll use it more. You have to know what you need. And then we have data anonymization and pseudonymization. We'll have a great, that's a big topic. It's a difficult, big topic that we'll have another training on, and it's given by Enrico Clerian, which is, you know, world class in this field. So I really recommend that as well. That's a really difficult thing to do, to fully anonymize personal data, and we don't go to details here, but I suggest you check out that training. And then you have the privacy notice, which tells how the data will be handled throughout the process. And then you have the research ethical principle of informed consent, and you need those both. Data protection impact assessment is something that must be done if personal data processing is likely to pose a substantial risk to research participants. And this will likely occur if you, at least these are the guidelines from our university, if you process very large amounts of personal data, or process the personal data of children or other sensitive, these special categories of personal data. And as mentioned, this is often included, at least in the Finnish system. Ethical review is also a key aspect of ethical and legal compliance, which you should kind of go through in the DMP, whether your research needs it or not. And the quickest way to kind of get to know that is in my experience, to call the secretary of the committee. And if you're unsure, always call and check, because where the research should be. If there's some materials there, we could talk about ethical review for 45 minutes or an hour. So that's a whole big different topic. But I guess the key line is, if you're not sure if you need our ethical review, within the Finnish system, it's medical research is always, these kind of intervention studies, you can say maybe a rule of thumb that they are always kind of reviewed. The studies that use test animals are reviewed, and the special types of these kind of interaction studies with these kind of specialized research settings. For example, if you don't gather informed consent, then you need an ethical review, and you can't do that later on in the process. So that's something you have to pay kind of attention to. But maybe we go on to the next slide. This is very quickly. I think if you have these special cases of ethics, like test animals, you have artificial intelligence, medical research, I suggest you check out, for example, the ethical self-assessment tool that we have at Aalto. That's a very good tool, which you can very quickly kind of go through. And if you do computational studies, you know, within the Finnish team, you can offer, if you don't handle personal or it's non-confidential, you can kind of just discuss, for example, the reproducibility of your research, like how making data open, in fact, makes your research more ethical and more transparent and easy to produce. But I'm kind of, let's go forward. You can look at these later. We can ask questions. The ethical issue, that there's many. I suggest you look at the ethical compliance tool. It's also in the links. And then you have to you could look at the IPR management of your research results. This has to be put here in place. You can discuss whether you have these IPR offices or that will help you in commercialization. And then you would need to also know that who owns the data. For example, our university has an employment contract that makes transfers the data, for example, in external funding projects, such as Academia Finland transfers the data ownership to our researchers and to Aalto. And in consortium projects, remember to agree on who owns the data and other collaborations as well. And we have some templates on how to do that and so. But ethical and legal compliance is a vast topic, and you can look at these hints in general. And but Kati, I think I did do more time than I was expected. So sorry about that.
No, I don't think you did. I think it's fine. Thank you so much, Antti. I'm just going to continue and the data documentation that when I talk about it here, it concerns data acquisition, data storing, data analysis, and data sharing phases from a point of view of writing a data management plan. So metadata is really the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your research. The metadata is data about data. And in DMP, you are often asked to elaborate on metadata standards that you will use to describe your data. So metadata standards are sets of, they're like collection of elements that describe your data. Like we have the common Dublin core metadata standard that has 15 elements, like creator, title, and so on. And from my point of view, when we think about research, the problem is that for other phases in data sharing, there are not many tools for researchers in different fields to describe their data using metadata standards. So there are no tools. There may be some tools for some fields of research, like for instance, I have research background myself, and I have been writing data management plans as a researcher, and I could not find proper tools to describe my data when I was acquiring data. But this can be resolved by, for instance, creating your own tools for when you analyze data or you collect data. You can basically have an Excel sheet where you use a metadata standard in your field to describe your data. And just to give you maybe inspiration, we have listed inside the green box below some metadata standards. There are also lists of controlled vocabularies, which are just a standardized way of describing lists of words. Like for instance, we can have names of countries or languages. And here's an example on the CIF controlled vocabulary, which is dedicated to the field of crystallography. Okay, but as you will see shortly, the situation changes when you share your data, because then you use data repositories that have metadata standards behind them. So when you write a DMP, you can just think about what data repositories you will use, and then find out what metadata standards or controlled vocabularies those repositories use. And another thing I want to bring out in this context is the topic of fairness, because if you look at, for instance, the Horizon Europe data management plan template, you will see that many of the questions revolve around fairness, how to make data fair, and that's a really, really complex and maybe a difficult topic as well. But I'm going to give you like a very basic example of how it can be described in a DMP. And for those who are interested, you can check the original article by Dr. Mark Wilkinson, who wrote it with his colleagues in 2016, where he introduced this concept to us, and which is meant to promote data reuse and findability, not only about data, but also about metadata. And in the original context, they spoke about making data fair for computers, but as we will see, it also can be used in the context of human readable files and data. So now I'm going to go into a real life example that I'm going to use here as a data set that I created with my colleagues 2 years ago. This is a real data set that we created for a paper called Monitoring the Water Stress of an Indoor Living Wall System using the triangle method. And this data set was shared in Harvard Dataverse, which is a common so-called generalist data repository, meaning that it can be used in many different fields of research. And if you look at our data set here, you see that we have different kinds of metadata. We have citation metadata, and we have geospatial metadata, and even journal metadata. And because I found out, I know that when you look at the citation metadata, behind this in the repository, there's the Dublin Core metadata standard and also the data site metadata standard. So I can just describe them in my DMP that I'm going to share my data in this repository, and it has these metadata standards behind it. It also has geospatial metadata, and in this example here we have Singapore, because that's the country where the study was conducted. And here we have a control vocabulary called ISO 3166 that was used here. So that's something that can be described as well. And we have a third layer of metadata, which is the README file, and that's unstructured here. It's unstructured information, but if we had been really smart, we would have used some metadata standards inside that README file as well to describe our data set. So there are these different layers that can be described in a DMP. And when it comes to fairness, we have this data repository here, and because the metadata are always accessible, that is, I mean, to anyone, that is what makes the dataset more findable and accessible. And because we have these metadata standards and controlled vocabularies, that is what makes the dataset more interoperable and reusable. And that's a very basic example of that can be used when we describe data and documentation, metadata standards in a data management plan. I'm going to go back to the presentation, but you have the example here that I just showed you using the data set itself. It's more interesting that way, I think. Okay. Yeah, and then I'm going to go into data storing and analysis topic. And I'm not going to talk so much about this because I think that this is generally very well described in a DMP. And as I mentioned earlier, and Antti mentioned as well, we also have webinars coming up. And one of the webinars is about data storing. So it doesn't make sense for me to go into this in detail. But I just want to mention that those who work or study at Aalto, we have two main storage solutions. We have the network drives and we have the cloud services. And in a DMP, it's important to remember to describe how you store your data, but also how you plan to share your data with your collaborators. The collaborators can be in the same university or they can be outside of your own university. And if they're outside of your own university, at least here at Aalto, we could not use network drive. So in that case, we need to use cloud services to share our data. Something that I sometimes see in the DMPs is that people want to use their own computers or external hard drives, but that is not recommendable because there are many things. But for instance, there may not be regular backups. External hard drives can get broken, and data may not be encrypted in them. So it's better. Instead of using those hard drives or personal laptops, it's better to use Aalto laptops or workstations when possible, and at least use the network drives and virtual environments that Aalto provides for those who work at Aalto. If you have sensitive data, you can use network drives for as long as you encrypt your data and you make it access restricted. Confidential data can be also saved in the network drives for as long as you make it access restricted. And I have collected this list here with our IT services to show you if you want to use cloud services, for instance, for sharing your data with your external partners, how you can do that. So we have Google, Dropbox, Teams, OneDrive, and eDowney by CSC here at Aalto at our disposal. So if you have public data, meaning like any ordinary instrument data that is not personal data, you can use any of these with no problems. But if you have personal data or sensitive data, you have to be more careful. And if you take an example on sensitive data, if I go into the list and I see that I can use Teams, it's okay, I use Teams. But if I use Teams, I can only use it if I encrypt my data and I limit to authorized people and I don't do link sharing. So hopefully this table can help you when you write your DMP, if you work at Aalto. So this is very Aalto specific. And there's a webinar coming up on the topic, as I already mentioned. So it's actually, I think it's next week on Tuesday, but if you are interested, there's a link and you can still register for it and join that webinar. Going to the topic that is, I think, the most demanding generally to our researchers based on the questions that we get and the discussion, I would say that is data sharing. And I think it's a complex thing, but it's also something new to researchers, so that's why it may feel more complex than what it really is, because it hasn't been that many years that we have had these requirements of data sharing and data repositories. But in a DMP, data sharing really means sharing your data in a data repository. And here it means like sharing your data with the whole world. So as opposed to the previous section, here you don't discuss just sharing your data with your collaborators, but here you discuss it with sharing your data with everyone in the world. At least you have to consider if you can do that. It may not always be possible, as we will see. And we sometimes see that people say that, okay, I will use my scientific papers and that's how we do my data sharing. But when we think about, if you look at funder requirements and you look at open science requirements nowadays, that's not what data sharing is about. So in many DMP templates, you don't even need to discuss publications at all. And we sometimes often get asked if supplementary materials qualify for data sharing. And that depends, because nowadays some funders may request, like for instance, that you have to use trusted repositories for sharing your data. But if you use supplementary materials, let's say you have very extensive supplementary materials that you share along with your paper, you cannot always, at least in my experience, the journal dictates where your supplementary materials are deposited. Even if you get a DOI, you cannot put the metadata there. You cannot choose the repository. The repository may not be a trusted repository as your funder wants it. So I would say that in many cases, it's recommendable to choose the repository where you want to share your data, share it, and then just have a link into the paper where you where you tell others where your data is available. So I would say that's in most cases recommendable. And just to give you some inspiration, there are links again inside the green box below where there are data repositories. The list is given here by the European Commission. And there is also a comparison between different data repositories, some generalized data repositories, and how much it costs to share your data in them, and how much data you can deposit there. So where to share? There are some like attributes in a good data repository. Like one of the things is that it provides persistent identifiers like DOIs. That's important because persistent identifiers, as name implies, they are really like permanent links to your data set. So others can use them and you get credit for your work. And also that it's recommendable that the repository would provide recommended citations to make the data more findable, basically. Like if you look at the real life example again, you should be seeing my screen where I shared the data set. We have a recommended citation to this specific data set, so others know how to cite it. And there's also a DOI here that is like a permanent link to this data set that doesn't expire. Okay, and then we have something that repository should be something that allows for metadata, rich metadata to be added. And as we saw in the example, at least the Dataverse repository allows for that. There are many fields for adding metadata. And something that allows for licensing, because the license tells others how they can use the data. In this example, if I look at it, we have in the terms section, we have here we have a license. So this data set, specific data set has been shared using the CC0 license, meaning no rights reserved. So that means that anyone can use the data set as they see best. And there are community norms and scientific practices, which even if I share my data using the CC0 license, they dictate good scientific practices that others, if they use my data set, they will give credit to me, even if the license itself doesn't require it. But that's something to keep in mind. And then there is something like good attributes of a good data repository. One of the things is that it ensures long-term preservation of your data. And you can estimate it based on, for instance, who is maintaining the repository and how long it has been there. And something that gives your data visibility and is dedicated into your own field of research. And it may not always be possible to find such a repository in your own field of research. And in that case, you can just pick on so-called generalist repository like Zenodo, FAIR Data, Finnish Social Sciences Data Archive, or another one. There are many different repositories available out there. We sometimes see DMPs that people would like to use their personal websites or cloud services like Dropbox to share their data. They don't really qualify because they don't provide DOIs and persistent identifiers and metadata and things like that are really necessary. So it doesn't work well. And nowadays, the trend is that at least funders ask you to not only share your data, but also share software, algorithms, protocols, and many different things like physical samples. So what you see in the upper bullet point, what I have highlighted in bold, I have taken all of those from the Horizon Europe framework guidelines. So the framework program guidelines say that, for instance, software is a recommendable, shareable research output. The trend is that you would, in a DMP, you would have to describe also if you are planning to share, for instance, software and where you want to share it. And I have listed here some dedicated software repositories. I'm personally familiar with GitHub. I'm not so familiar with the others, but I wanted to bring out those that I found because they may be useful for you to share your software. You could also share software, of course, using, for instance, Zenodo, but Zenodo is not designed for that. So for software, it may be recommendable to use a dedicated repository like GitHub, but it's up to you, really. And then there are some services for sharing protocols, meaning descriptions of how you conduct, for instance, a scientific experiment. And I think that's a very good trend in science because that may save your efforts. But if you can use a description that someone else has created, that's easier for you. You don't need to write it out, and it also standardizes the way science is being made. But in a DMP, you could just describe that, okay, I'm going to share my protocols in this or that service that you choose. So what not to share? I would say that it's not useful to share data that is not the data of quality. For instance, if you have a day when you have collected data and there has been a problem with the instrument, it doesn't make sense to share that kind of data because it might even be harmful if others use it and they don't realize that there's something wrong with it. So it's good to share data that is of good quality. And then you should not also share data that you don't have IP rights for, or if there are agreements that prevent you from sharing your data. For instance, if you have industrial partners and you have non-disclosure agreements and you cannot share your data, that's possible that you cannot do it. Or if you have personal or sensitive data that cannot be fully anonymized, by default, it's not possible to share such data. And here is just to note that not all sensitive data is personal data. It can be, for instance, what I've seen is that it can be, for instance, the locations of endangered species or something like that. But I think the key takeaway here is that if you cannot share your data, explain why not. And many funders understand that not all data can be shared, and there's a common a guideline for that data should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary, that many funders are saying. And what if you cannot share your data openly and immediately? Well, you can usually share the metadata of your data, and some funders like the Academy of Finland actually require that you do that. And there are dedicated repositories for metadata sharing, like the QY repository here in Finland, or our own ACRIS current information system here at Aalto. And many repositories allow for restricted data access, meaning that you upload your data, but then you lock it, and then others have to ask you to have the data and and you can decide on a case-by-case basis whether you will grant access or not. And you can also consider embargoes, meaning that you don't release the data immediately, but you have like for instance 6 months after the whatever stage in your project. You just have to justify it in a DMP what you plan to do. So you could, for instance, say that I will share my data at the time of publication, for instance. And licensing is a topic that I could speak a long time about, but at this point, because I don't just have enough time, I will only mention that commonly used licenses are CC BY and the CC0, and they are commonly accepted by funders and legislation, at least here in Finland. The CC BY really says that those who use your data, they should give credit for it. And just to note that in Finland, a new law became effective in July that dictates that if you have publicly funded research data that you have shared in a repository, you have to allow for commercial use. So if you are in such a situation, you could not use, for instance, the CC BY non-commercial license that doesn't allow for commercial use. Software has its own set of licenses, and Creative Commons is not recommended because it's not designed for software at all. And there's a link for software licenses there. So in the context of data sharing, how do you speak about FAIR? Here's a very basic example. We use the same example that we had before. So in the example, the dataset has a digital object identifier, as we saw, and that makes the dataset more findable. And because the DOI resolves to a landing page that provides access to metadata and different things, that makes the dataset more findable, accessible, and reusable. And because the repository Dataverse that we use provides machine accessible interfaces to data and other things, that makes the dataset more accessible. So this example has been modified from the paper by Mark Wilkinson, that the original introduction to FAIR data. And as I already said, it's a very complex topic, and there are many different ways of making data fair, but this is just one way of describing things as an example in a data management plan. The last topic here is archiving of your data, and it's something that is sometimes a separate section in a DMP. So archiving really means that you transfer data into long-term storage when you don't need it anymore, when it's no longer in active use. And you could use services like the National Digital Preservation Services here that is available here in Finland for archiving your data. But in a DMP, if you don't have particularly valuable data, I think in most cases you could just describe how you share your data in Zenodo, for instance, or another repository, because these real archiving services, they are aimed for data that is particularly valuable, and those data will be preserved for centuries. And another thing to describe in a long-term preservation section of the DMP is to describe what happens to the data that you will not be archiving, because in many cases there's a lot of good data that you just don't use for one reason or another. What will happen to that? Where will you keep it? Who is responsible for it, and so on? And then you can also describe if you will be deleting some of your data, when will you delete it? And those of you who may process personal data may have written something in the privacy notice of your privacy notice to describe how long you will keep your data. So there's a link there to a DMP. And I will conclude with the verse of the Finnish Data Protection Ombudsman, who says that at the end of the personal data lifespan, the data can be destroyed, anonymized, or archived if there are grounds for doing so. But the processing of personal data must justify the primary purpose for which it was collected, and only in exceptional cases can data be considered so valuable that it can be stored for any other purposes than the primary purpose. And we have a webinar coming up next week on data sharing. It's a very hands-on webinar, how you can upload your data into Zenodo repository. So there's a link for registering for that. And then because we don't have much time, I would like to preserve it for questions. So I will just show you that we have some templates here, links to them, policies. So there are links to Aalto web pages for those who work or study at Aalto. So you can use these when you write a DMP to see some tips and tricks of, like for instance, handling of personal data. And we have 2 DMP exemplars for the Academy of Finland by our own researchers. They have kindly shared it with us. We have the DMP evaluation guidance that can help you to write a DMP if you write it, for instance, for the Academy of Finland, because it gives you like the qualities of poor, good, and excellent DMPs. We have for the University of Vienna, we have more than 800 DMP exemplars for the Horizon 2020 program. I don't know if people write those DMPs anymore because the program has ended, but I was thinking that it may be useful for the Horizon Europe program, even if the questions are different. And then there are some DMP tools that can help you make it more structured, the DMP writing. And here at Aalto, if you have any problems, you can always contact research data at aalto.fi or contact one of our data agents. And if you have problems with coding or you need help with it, you can contact the research software engineers. And anyone in the world can attend our RDM training, as we have seen here today. It was exciting to have people from so many different places. So of course, the examples we have given are generic because we have only a limited time and incomplete in the sense that we couldn't cover all aspects that we would have wanted. But I hope that this was of use to you when you write your DMPs in the future. Thank you very much on my behalf. And I think we can stop the recording here and go into the Q&A. We still have 5 more minutes.